Welcome back, everyone. Glad to have you joining us on this third Monday, the 16th of February, 2026, for another episode of Crime in the Courtroom. We're going to take some time on today's show to talk about the Nancy Guthrie abduction. We just have to do it, and we certainly do it with the hopes that it is just and only that, an abduction, and that we aren't yet dealing with a murder, whether by violence or by the withholding of medical treatment, as reports have indicated that Ms. Guthrie, the mother of NBC's Today Show, the host, Savannah Guthrie, requires constant medical intervention and care, including a pacemaker. So at this point, her survival would require her, at the age of 84, to endure being separated not only from her home and from her family, but from her necessary medical resources. Now, I want to be clear that my goal today is not to go into great depth about the actual events that took place or specific timelines, as this case has received an incredible amount of attention and media coverage for obvious reasons. So we'll do a quick review, but what I'd really like to focus on, particularly for our audience members who do not work daily in the criminal justice system, are a couple of perspectives that might help us to gain a better understanding of what is often described as a high-profile investigation, what that means, some of the challenges that are associated with them, and what is likely to bring Nancy Guthrie home alive if she and we are so lucky to have that happen. One of the striking elements of the Nancy Guthrie case, of course, is the scale of the response. From the beginning, multiple agencies, including law enforcement and the FBI, have committed, or I should say local law enforcement and the FBI, and I would presume state law enforcement agencies as well, have committed significant manpower and technical resources to the search. Authorities have conducted extensive neighborhood canvassing, they've executed search warrants, they've reviewed surveillance footage, they've deployed specialized forensic tools, and they've publicly appealed for information. And the reward for credible tips has now reached six figures, reportedly. And because the case has received sustained national media coverage, it has generated thousands of public tips and kept the investigation in the spotlight. So by any measure, this has been a highly visible and from what we can tell, a very well-resourced effort. But that visibility also raises a difficult and important contrast. And that is to say that each year in the United States, hundreds of thousands of people are reported missing. Most of those cases do not receive prolonged national attention. Many families struggle to keep their loved one's story in the public eye beyond the first news cycle. Advocacy groups and criminologists have long noted disparities in media coverage and public engagement, particularly along the lines of things like race and socioeconomic status and the perceived newsworthiness of the investigation. Now, fortunately, stranger abductions of elderly individuals are rare, and they understandably trigger great urgency, but the scale of the response in a nationally recognized case can underscore how differently resources and attention are distributed or appear to be distributed across the broader missing persons landscape, which is remarkable, assuming we permit ourselves to look at it that way. So calling to mind that contrast or that tension certainly does not and should not diminish the seriousness of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Instead, what it does, I think, is it highlights a larger systemic reality, which is that investigative intensity is often shaped not only by the facts on the ground, but also by public visibility and media amplification. And for many families, without that amplification, the search can feel quite underwhelming. So we will build on this theme in just a moment. But first, what I would like to do is just pause and to express my deep thanks to our generous sponsor, Promega, and their team of life science professionals who, among their many important responsibilities, play host to the annual International Symposium on Human Identification, which is the largest conference in existence dedicated to the practice challenges and opportunities of forensic DNA testing. As we announced a couple of weeks ago, this year's symposium will be held in Providence, Rhode Island, October 26th to the 29th. And you can visit ishnews.com, that's ishinews.com, for more information, and come join me and my colleagues to see firsthand how the outstanding team of experts at Promega are turning questions into discoveries each and every day. You can learn more about Promega and their important mission of applying life science to enhancing and protecting our quality of life by visiting www.promega.com. Now, we have to be extremely careful when we call out these contrasts that we talked about a moment ago, because they don't tell the entire story. Yes, the fact that Ms. Guthrie is the mother of one of the most famous media personalities in the United States certainly provides a degree of motivation and urgency that is uncommon. And it would seem to some as unfair that such motivation and urgencies are not brought to the disappearance of a victim who does not have a comparable public profile. But there's a huge problem with this kind of what I would describe envy-based analysis of an investigation like this. Because what it does is it ignores what are many extreme disadvantages of being a high-profile victim or trying to execute a competent and complete investigation of this sort, and there are many. So high-profile cases come with enormous disadvantages, not the least of which is the publicity that can have a sometimes catastrophic impact on an investigation and the search for a perpetrator or perpetrators. This year is the 30th anniversary of the 1996 Olympic bombing in Atlanta, which I'll be talking about in a couple of months, in which I was deeply involved with. And that was a case in which Richard Jewell, if you may remember him, Clint Eastwood made a movie about him titled Richard Jewell in 2019. His life was basically destroyed when he was falsely implicated by investigators and the press amid the international chaos that came in the wake of the bombing. When a case becomes national or international news, not only is law enforcement exposed to very intense pressure to solve the case, but they are also inundated with tips, many that are well-intentioned and many that are not. And they may have to sort through thousands, even tens of thousands of leads, which consumes far more time, far more energy, and far more manpower than would be required in a lower profile case. Then, of course, in this area of social media and what we might call pseudo-journalism, public speculation has the effect of injecting noise and confusion into the consciousness of individuals who may be future witnesses, whose recollections and understanding of what they remember or what they saw or experienced might very well become critical, not only to the adjudication of the case in the courtroom, but in the investigation of the case in the hopes of getting it to the courtroom. But what happens is that with enough noise, witnesses can struggle to distinguish what they know from what they've heard. And if the case goes to trial, this can become a serious threat to the integrity of the proceedings themselves. And so as the public demands to be kept informed about what's going on, there is at the same time a heightened scrutiny of exactly what is said or what is not said. So these authorities, who are often tired and operating without much sleep and rest, have to be very measured in their statements so as to not compromise strategy or tip off the perpetrators about ways that they can avoid being found or detected. And of course, there are also the many sensitivities related to the emotions being felt by the victim's family. Just one screw up, or just one wrongly phrased statement by authorities, or just one even subtle investigative misstep can leave families and victims feeling like they are now being victimized by what they perceive as substandard professional performance on the part of these authorities. And then there is what I think is among the scariest of considerations, which is that the intense media pressure and attention can make perpetrators desperate. It can alter their behaviors. It can alter their risk calculations or their sense of risk. It can affect the speed at which they might decide to either release or dispose of their victims who might never be seen again. And there is the distinct possibility that the victim's family might never know if the victim is alive or where the victim is located. And that in itself is a form of hell that is probably beyond our wildest imagination. And if you think about a perpetrator, right now it's kind of looking like a single perpetrator, but we don't know that for sure. But if that perpetrator went into that house in the middle of the night and was not aware of whose house that was not aware that that was the mother of a famous media personality, once the public attention really cranks up, when that individual realizes that he has kidnapped someone that the entire world now knows about, that can trigger panic. And once that panic kicks in, it's hard to predict what that individual will do. So, look, there are clear advantages. I mean, make no mistake about this. We don't want to be naive and we don't want to dismiss this. There are advantages to public awareness and public attention, particularly if there are images or descriptions of a perpetrator that a viewer somewhere might recognize and therefore be able to tip authorities in that individual's direction. But this idea that high-profile investigations like this get some kind of special treatment or are generally advantageous as compared to a lower-profile case is quite narrow-minded and even perhaps ignorant because of how many problems public attention can, in fact, bring with it. Now, I want to say a few things about the forensic evidence in the Guthrie investigation, and I want to make it clear here that like most forensic experts out there, I myself had a specialized area. I was a firearm and tool mark examiner, so I'm not a DNA analyst. Although as a forensic laboratory administrator for 13 years, I managed DNA operations, but I don't have a scientific background in that area, so I want to just make sure that I'm transparent about that. But generally speaking, when it comes to forensic evidence, not only in cases like this, but in any case, there are two tiers of forensic evidence, or what we might call the application of forensic evidence in unsolved cases like this. One is forensic evidence that specifically leads investigators to the perpetrator or perpetrators of the crime. In other words, it more or less ends the investigation because it gives police a very high level of confidence that no one else could be involved and no one else could be responsible. So they're done. And now the case gets handed off to the prosecution. The second tier is forensic evidence that is used to prove guilt during a criminal trial, assuming it goes to trial. And that is a very different use of forensic evidence that will include a defendant's attorney trying to discredit the evidence or the expert witness who is presenting it. But what we have here in the Guthrie case is a painful example of what happens when there is intense investigative urgency, not only for the life of Ms. Guthrie, or to save the life of Ms. Guthrie, but also to be mindful of the possibility that this perpetrator will do this to someone else if they aren't captured, and assuming they haven't already. But when you don't have a suspect in custody, or you don't have a search warrant to execute at the premises or property of a possible perpetrator, then you've got a very serious problem on your hands. You don't have any fingers to compare a fingerprint to. You don't have any shoes or boots to compare a footwear impression to, impressions that were recovered from the crime scene or seen at the crime scene. You don't have a gun to compare a bullet or a cartridge case to. You don't have a bolt cutter or a hammer or a pry bar to compare to any tool marks that are observed at the crime scene. So it's quite possible that there is a lot of forensic evidence in the Guthrie case that very well could be a possibility, and some could argue that it's a probability. But until you have something to compare it to, it's not going to help you. So a fingerprint on its own is useless. A bullet on its own is useless. It's the comparison that is valuable. Comparing a bullet to a suspect's gun, comparing a fingerprint from the crime scene to the known fingerprints of the person when they are arrested and booked at the jail. So in the absence of that kind of comparative forensic evidence on the investigative side of the equation, this is where databases come in, which have been in use now for maybe about 3 decades or a little bit more. So the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, is for fingerprints. For example, you could have a latent fingerprint at a crime scene, and if the perpetrator has been arrested before, then a possible match can occur within the database that helps to identify the finger from which the crime scene print was made. One of the more interesting possibilities, however, in the Guthrie case is the potential use of what's called forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or FIGG, to develop leads that might reveal a perpetrator. Now, this is a relatively new investigative method in which I'm going to do my best to explain this, in which a DNA profile, for example, a usable profile, let's say in this case developed from a glove that was reportedly recovered in the case, can be analyzed and searched in a way that goes beyond the traditional methods that are used for law enforcement purposes. So when I say typical law enforcement purposes, what I mean is that in a typical investigation, assuming there is such a thing, the crime scene DNA, or any crime scene DNA, is entered into CODIS, the National Law Enforcement Database that compares STR, which stands for short tandem repeat, profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in qualifying jurisdictions, and other forensic samples. If there's no direct match in CODIS, the case can be at risk of stalling, especially if DNA is the only forensic evidence available. So FIGG, forensic investigative genetic genealogy, is very different. Instead of looking for a direct match to a known offender, what investigators are doing under specific legal and policy guidelines is they can, with some scientific assistance, can convert a qualifying DNA sample into a SNP-based, and SNP, SNP, stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. It's a mouthful technical term, doesn't matter right now, but basically it's a profile similar to the kind that are used by private consumer ancestry testing companies. Many of you are familiar with Ancestry.com or 23andMe and so forth. So that profile, the evidence profile, can then be uploaded to genealogy databases that permit law enforcement use. And so the goal here isn't to find the suspect directly, but to identify possible relatives, sometimes even third or fourth cousins who share segments of DNA with the perpetrator. From there, what you have is really fascinating. You have these specially trained genealogists who go to work building family trees, sometimes spanning multiple generations, using public records, obituaries, census data, and other kinds of open sources. And these investigators can then narrow the field by applying more traditional factors that we would all be familiar with in your typical investigation, such as the location or geography involved, the age, the sex, criminal history of individuals, proximity to the crime scene, and other case-specific evidence. So if a possible perpetrator emerges, then what law enforcement can do is confirm the identity the old-fashioned way. In fact, they have to, typically by obtaining a direct DNA sample and then comparing it to the original evidence. So that forensic genealogy approach is reserved for those cases where you have DNA evidence, but just nothing to compare it to. And you don't have any other kind of evidence that is helping to lead to a perpetrator or close out the investigation. So, whether or not Ms. Guthrie would still be alive as all of this took place is an entirely different matter. But it's important to emphasize that forensic investigative genetic genealogy does not replace conventional investigative work. What it does is it augments it by generating very, very specialized kinds of leads. It doesn't prove guilt. It doesn't eliminate the need for warrants. It usually doesn't actually identify the perpetrator, him or herself. It's still going to require statement corroboration and prosecutorial review and all the rest. And it's also very important to know that its use is strictly governed by Department of Justice policy, and in many states, additional restrictions because of the constitutional privacy concerns that are involved. So if investigators in the Guthrie case have developed a high quality DNA profile that does not match anyone in CODIS, then the FIGG could theoretically provide a path forward. But even when it works, and sometimes it does, it is quite labor intensive, it's quite time consuming, and it's highly dependent on both the quality of the DNA evidence and what you have available in the genealogical databases. In other words, it's powerful, but it's not magic. So I'd like to close by mentioning something that I emphasized in my upcoming book, Valid Comparisons, which I expect to be released in hopefully late March, early April. That's the goal right now. And that is to say that the same forensic evidence that is desperately being collected and analyzed to help find Ms. Guthrie and identify her abductor or abductors will be scrutinized, and every effort will be made to discredit it by any defendant's attorneys, assuming that this case ever goes to trial, and we certainly hope it does. In my book, I write about what I call the Daubert contagion, which was the spread of gross information about forensic science and forensic experts after the 1993 Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals case, a historic landmark case involving the testimony of expert witnesses. And one of the points that I make in the book is that the courtroom treatment of forensic evidence has become a bit elitist over the last few decades, as if forensic science is, as it's often said, is junk science, as it's called by its critics, or is not sufficiently validated by the standards that are supposedly applied in medicine, for example, or other scientific fields. And so I deal with those claims in the book in a rather direct and forthright way, and I think a quite successful way. However, it's in cases like this, the kidnapping of 84-year-old Ms. Nancy Guthrie, who is reportedly in frail or infirm condition, taken right from her home in the middle of the night. You have to thank the heavens above that we have these different forms of forensic evidence to help tell the story of what happened, to identify who was responsible, and hope that somehow, by the grace of God, Ms. Guthrie will survive this ordeal. And whether or not that happens, of course, time will only tell. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Crime in the Courtroom. As always, the opinions expressed on our show are those of your host, John Collins, that's me, as well as our guests, and should not be construed as representing the opinions of our sponsors, our collaborators, or any other professionals or organizations with whom we may be affiliated. Just as a quick reminder, if you are interested in our world-class on-demand and affordable training program for building your authoritative presence and conflict management skills, please visit criticalvictories.com/showupstrong. And if you are a police commander, forensic scientist, or laboratory administrator, or a professional in a high responsibility occupation looking for a powerful but convenient way to achieve the high resolution self-awareness necessary to be at your best, even when everything is on the line, please check out my coaching page at criticalvictories.com/coaching. That's criticalvictories.com/coaching. You can start the process right away without any obligation, and I would love to work with you and any members of your team striving to build the skills and internal strength that they need to meet whatever new or growing responsibilities they've been entrusted with. We'll see you next time, everybody, for another edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Let's all be safe, let's all be great, and let's all stay committed to being a force for good and for protecting our quality of life from sea to shining sea. Thanks again, everyone.